Hello, welcome to another Brookbanks Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wakeling. I'm very, very pleased to have with me today Paul Smith, who is Managing Director of the Strategic Land Group. You'll have seen him, no doubt, on LinkedIn. He is the coiner of the phrase grit in the system, so see if you can use that during our conversation today, Paul. And a font of all knowledge on the planning system. Today we're going to be talking about the housing crisis, something that hits headlines on an almost weekly basis, but we're going to be exploring a bit more about what it is, how we got here, and most importantly, really what's happening uh, government-wise, and in other areas to try and sort out what the housing crisis is. But before we get stuck into that, Paul, I'll just ask you to give a quick introduction.
Yeah, morning, Ben. Thanks for having me. Yeah, like you said, I'm the managing director of Strategic Land Group. So I'm both a chartered town planner and a chartered surveyor. In my career, I've worked at PLC house builders, at planning consultancies, and I write a lot and speak to a lot of people about the planning system generally, I think, and ways that we can try and make it better. So all this sort of stuff around the housing crisis, it is really interesting. It's the stuff that fascinates me, really. So yeah, it's great to have the chance to talk to you about it.
Oh, it's great to have you on, and I mean we'll start with the basics really. For those who are new to the industry or just starting out, or who have seen the headlines about housing crisis, what is the housing crisis? It sounds very dramatic.
Yeah, it does, and I think we all instinctively know what it is, which is that houses are really, really expensive. And very much out of kilter with incomes these days. So, the median house price is now getting on for 8 times the median income. And when you think you can typically only borrow about 3.5 times your income from a mortgage, you start to see that there's a big gap there between the affordability of homes, what people can afford to pay for homes and where the pricing is. And that starts to create all sorts of consequential problems. And I think it's the consequential problems that are the key thing, actually. Some rather than the affordability per se, it's things like, you could argue that there's a fault line in society now between those that own a home and those that don't, those that can be supported by the bank of mum and dad to buy a property and those that can't and therefore end up renting for longer as a result. But you see it in all sorts of other areas. Shelter publish a report every year about the number of families in temporary accommodation, and every year the number goes up. There's about 170,000 homes who are living, 170,000 children who are living in temporary accommodation at the moment, which is a huge number. You see it in the number of concealed families that we have. So concealed families, concealed households are those that would form if there were a house for them to move into. So it's people that are flat sharing or at home with their parents still when ideally they would move out. And back in 1997, there were about 1.8 million of those concealed families. It's nearly 2.6 million now. So it's a huge increase in a fairly short period of time. And you see it in home ownership rates, that we talk about home ownership being the English dream, that everybody wants to own their own home. And in fact, you hear some people saying that we wouldn't have a housing crisis if people weren't so obsessed with home ownership. But we actually have lower levels of home ownership in England than the EU and the developed world averages. We are an outlier in terms of home ownership, but not in the direction that people think. And all those things then start having knock-on effects into all sorts of other areas of society. There's a great essay called The Housing Theory of Everything, which talks about how some of these impacts then start filtering into all sorts of other areas, things that you would think are as unrelated as fertility rates, obesity rates, that they can all, that the housing crisis and the affordability of homes, the unaffordability of homes, has an impact on all of those. So it's a huge issue. It's one of the biggest problems that we face in the UK, I think.
That's really fascinating. I was going to start with what you were saying about affordability rates being 8 times, the median house price being 8 times median income. But that last sentence you just mentioned there about housing theory of everything. So the housing crisis directly or indirectly affects things such as fertility you mentioned there, and things such as obesity, really.
Yeah. So
How does that work?
if you take fertility rates as an example, if you are going to start a family, you probably want the security of knowing that you're going to be in that home for a period of time. You're much more likely to start a family if you own a home than if you rent somewhere on a 6 month tenancy where actually you might not know where you're going to live at the end of it. And because it takes longer for people to save to be able to buy a home, you've got to, even if you can afford the repayments on a mortgage, as house prices go up, you need a bigger and bigger deposit, which means you need to save for longer and longer and longer. The average age of the first time buyer is going up and up and up. It's in the mid 30s now. And if you don't have a secure home until you're in your mid 30s, you're less likely to start trying to have a family until you're in your mid 30s, which dramatically reduces the number of childbearing years that couples have. And you can see that fertility rates are falling in England and in the UK. And I'm not saying it's all down to that. There's all sorts of other factors as well, but it is undoubtedly a contributory factor that the younger people are when they buy their own home, the more likely they are to have larger families.
Absolutely, that's really interesting because there's, just from reading the news, a wider issue with underpopulation, not just in the UK but across a lot of countries actually, and some countries are going to kind of great lengths to encourage people to have kids. But anyway, we're straying off slightly, but I was really interested in that comment. You mentioned affordability, and it always makes me chuckle because if I'm going to generalize people here of an older generation, which is a really terrible thing to do, but if you were to say to them, if you were trying to buy a house and you were to say to them the struggles that you're having in pulling together a deposit and getting a mortgage, they would probably say, and again I'm generalizing, oh, it was the same in my day. But it really wasn't, was it? If you look at the graph of affordability back in whatever their day may have been, the 50s, 60s, and I'm not an expert, so the figures I rattle off here might be slightly wrong, but I'm sure it was probably the average house was probably, 3 times the average wage, maybe four, but it certainly wasn't eight, was it? So it's really ramped up over the last few decades, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely has. Um, what always makes me smile is, I don't live in a particularly grand house, Ben. I live in a three-bed semi in a suburb of Manchester. And when we bought this house, the deposit I paid was more than my parents paid to buy their first house.
Yeah,
Now I know,
yes,
right? I know some of that is inflationary factors and all the rest of it, but as house prices become more and more expensive, it's that deposit point which becomes really important. That it takes longer and longer to save up the 5 or 10% deposit that is necessary to unlock the mortgage, even if you're content you can make the mortgage repayments because actually you've been paying rental, making rental payments that have been that level for years and years and years. And I think that's one of the reasons why, when you look at house builders and the incentives they offer on their development site, some sort of deposit match scheme is often a go-to product, because if they can find a way uh, of helping increase that deposit, that unlocks a dramatic number of purchases. They'd much rather offer 5% deposit match than a 5% discount on the headline price, wouldn't they? Because
yeah,
it, it,
absolutely.
it makes a bigger difference in terms of affordability.
Yeah, and as you say, the average first-time buyer now is in their mid-30s, which they're sitting at home trying desperately to get on the housing ladder and really, really struggling. And I mean, house prices in general have just gone absolutely wild over the last few years. We're potentially looking at moving house. I'm going to digress again. And as you can imagine, my wife is on Rightmove almost constantly. And on Rightmove, you can see the history of each house and what it sold for. And some houses, even in just 10 years, will have been bought back in 2010, 2015 for 150 grand, and then been sold 7, 8, 9 years later for double that. And again, I'm generalizing, but you can see why it's so difficult to get on the housing ladder, and why it's so difficult for people to own their own home. I mean, before we move on to what the current numbers are really saying, and apologies if you don't know the stats off the top of your head, but or your thoughts on this, but do you think home ownership is still a huge desire for a lot of people, or do you think that's a slightly old-fashioned view, or do you think that people are being forced into not having it as a life desire because they can't actually afford them in the first place?
Yeah, it's a great question. So when you look at survey data on this, owning a home is still the number one preferred tenure for an overwhelming majority of the population. It's sort of 70, 80% of people say that that's what they would like to do. But there are also increasing numbers of people who say that they don't think they will ever be able to attain that.
Mm,
So yes, it's the preferred tenure for most, but very large numbers of people think that it's just going to be impossible.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
because of those affordability issues. And fundamentally, you talked about all those dynamics about house price increases, affordability ratios, and all the rest of it. This is fundamentally an issue of supply and demand that,
mm,
we don't have enough homes to go around. And, how many homes you need is a bit of a, very difficult question to answer. And it's not an exact science because as people get wealthier, your what you call your housing consumption increases. So you want bigger homes, you want more homes. So it's not an exact science, but what we can say is that we have in England we have fewer homes per capita than the developed world average. So the European average is for to have 542 homes per thousand people, and in England we have 446. So that's nearly 20% fewer,
yeah.
right? And to put that in context, if we have the same number of homes per capita as France, which is above average, but not like massively above average, if we had the same number of homes per capita as France, we'd have about 6 million more. And there are about 24 million homes in the housing stock at the moment. So if you think about what that means in terms of a proportionate increase and how different would the dynamics of the housing market be if we had that extra 6 million homes? And it can be very easy sometimes for people to say, oh, building more homes won't impact on prices. But that simply isn't what the evidence shows. There is a strong relationship between countries which have more homes per thousand people having more affordable housing. And you can see it even within countries. And America's quite good for this because America's so vast with, uh, and again, I'm going to be quite glib in generalizing here, Ben, but it's so vast with such big gaps between places that there are lots of very distinct housing market areas which are part of the same country and part of the same structure of law and part of the same national economy and all the rest of it, but have very, very different housing policies. Because planning is dealt with at the city and state level. And places that build more have more affordable homes. It's really clear. And you see it in the UK as well. We are often told about the number of the fact that there was a lot of empty homes in London during the last census, which because was in the middle of the pandemic when lots of people left London to go and live in. They let their tenancies come to an end and moved out to London to go and live with parents or friends or in the countryside or whatever. And because during that period there was a massive number of empty homes in London, and what happened to rents? They plummeted. So we see it all the time when there are more homes available, house prices fall. And a good indicator as to whether or not a housing market is stressed is the number of vacant properties and uh, certainly the number of long-term empty properties, because that's what is the signal to homeowners and landlords that they need to lower their price, they need to lower their expectations. And we have essentially the lowest rate of long-term empty properties in Europe. It's a sign of a stressed housing market.
It really makes the government's 1.5 million homes kind of it's a drop in the ocean, isn't it, really? And we can get into all the reasons why that might be a tricky target to reach and so on. But it strikes me that there's so many factors that go into this. It's not an overnight fix. In my head now I'm thinking, well, have we got enough land to build all these? Say it's 6 million homes. Have we got enough land to build these 6 million homes on? I mean, I'm sure we have. I know we only build on a tiny proportion, but does that mean that we need to think about green belts? What do existing homeowners feel about their house price potentially coming down if more houses are being built? And how does the government keep people who are owning their own home currently satisfied, uh, but still manage affordability? Um, when might be sitting in their house thinking, well, I don't want my house value to go down, which is there's so many things to think about. Let's take it back to so we understand how many houses we need, and the answer is an awful lot. But how are we doing at the moment? How many homes are being built currently? Um, and then we'll move on to the planning system and how that's impacting or could impact either the number of houses being built either up or down. So how are we getting on with the 1.5 million target currently?
Yeah, not great. The
I thought that might be the answer. Yeah.
Yeah, the data around our housing market is and the planning system is poor, right? And believe it or not, we don't really know how many new homes we build every year. There are two or three different data sets that you can look at in different ways of trying to determine it, and they all give you slightly different answers. But we're probably building below 200,000 homes a year, and 1.5 million homes over the life of the Parliament, which is the government's aspiration. That is 300,000 homes a year on average. And because they haven't exceeded 200,000 homes a year so far this Parliament, it means by the end of it, you need to be delivering 400,000 to make up those shortfalls. And whilst the sort of the signs are pointing towards an increase in the coming years, it doesn't look as though, to me at least, that increase is going to be rapid enough to hit the figure. I'm fairly relaxed about that, to be honest. And I'll tell you why. I think the planning system, this, Ben, the planning system and housing development is really slow. It
Mm,
takes a long time to change the trajectory. And when it takes typically 2 years to get an outline planning consent for a scheme of 100 homes, and then probably 6 months on site before you actually have the first home ready for occupation, if you're lucky,
yeah.
probably nearer to 12 months on some projects, to turn planning reform into a home for somebody to live in takes 3 years from changing the policy, right? Before you start to see the impact of it. And the position that the government inherited in terms of both housing delivery, but also the um, sort of a less positive planning system for housing development meant it was always going to be a virtually impossible task.
Mm,
And the danger is that we get too fixated on will the government hit the 1.5 million homes target this parliament, and when it becomes obvious that they won't, and they won't, that provides, if we're not careful, that provides an opportunity to say, well, you're doing all the wrong things, or it's not the things that you said were the problem that are the problem. Clearly, otherwise you'd have hit the target. It's more to me about trying to make sure that the arrow is pointing in the right direction and that we can hit those higher levels of delivery in future years and we can start trying to catch up. Um, but yeah, when you start from a low base, it takes a long time to get the system moving again. Both consents coming through, labour capacity, house builders having the infrastructure and the regional office structure to be able to go and build these things. SMEs having the confidence that they can go out and borrow the money to go and build the site. So all these sorts of things that factor into it, and you need a stable, upward moving planning environment for a lot of those things to come to pass.
And do you think the very fact that planning reforms will take years. I'm weighing that up against what feels to me like a kind of political and general public sense that things need to be done immediately. So governments, for example, can only really think 5 years ahead because if you're Keir Starmer, you've got no idea if you're going to be in power come the next general election. And so the pressure must be on to try and change um, systems and structures within those 5 years. Whereas actually, what you're saying is for long-term growth and improvement, these changes will take 3 or 4 years to even implement. And the risk is that we'll get to the end of this parliament, we won't have built 1.5 million homes, and as you say, people will turn around and say, well, you've done all the wrong things. Um, it feels like there's an element of kind of immediate gratification needed by the general public who want to see things changing now because they want to build their own house, and politicians who also want to be seen to be delivering immediate change. And actually, there needs to be a message, perhaps, that change is happening, but it could take 5 or 10 years to see the benefits. But I mean, I might be wrong on that. That's just those are
No,
my
I
kind of
think
thoughts.
I think you I think you're right, and I'll come back to that in a second because what we've both done is what people involved in the development industry always do, is that we've talked about the housing crisis and then we've jumped to talking about the planning system, right? And
Yeah,
there are lots of people, some people who would dispute the leap we've made there as to what extent the planning system is responsible for some of the challenges we're seeing. And I think it's really important to address that because we can see it really clearly. There's been really decent studies on this that there was one academic study that said, by 2008, house prices would have been 35% lower were it not for the planning constraints in England. Now, some planning constraints are a good thing. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we should, rip up all planning policy and let house builders go and build whatever they want, wherever they want. But that starts to show you the scale of the impact, I think. And it's also important to talk about where we've seen planning reform be successful elsewhere, because part of the argument against planning reform is that it won't make any difference. That isn't the thing that's impacting build rates. I mean, firstly, I'd say slightly tongue-in-cheek, if it won't make any difference, what's the problem with it then? We can do whatever planning reform we want and nothing will change, right? So why get het up about it if you don't want development to happen? But when you look at where it has happened elsewhere, I mentioned the US before and what a great laboratory this is for, that is for the planning changes. And you can see it with places like Austin that have a very liberal planning environment and are growing rapidly and have falling rents and have really strong economies. One of the most attractive cities in the US to live in these days. But you see it in other places as well. New Zealand gets talked about a lot, where I had a really good conversation a couple of months ago with a guy called Stuart Donovan, an economist from Auckland, about planning reform in New Zealand. And they've done it 3 times there. They did it in Christchurch after the earthquake, where the government was concerned that because of the number of homes that have been damaged, housing costs would increase rapidly. So they liberalised the planning system to allow denser development, and actually house prices didn't go up at all. And on the back of that, they then introduced some similar planning reforms in Auckland, which was one of the most expensive cities in the world, which allow, one of the policies there actually is higher density development near transit stops, which is essentially where the new railway stations policy in the NPPF, the draft NPPF, has been lifted from. They did that as well as allowing densification of the suburbs. And housing costs in New Zealand have become more affordable compared to other places in New Zealand. And they did it again in another town in New Zealand, a place called Hook River, which nobody's ever heard of unless you're a planning geek like me. And they introduced a similar set of reforms, and guess what? They got the same results, right? So we see it again and again, and there's a brilliant example in the UK of Croydon, where they introduced a small sites policy to say these are the sorts of homes you can, we will give you planning permission for on, only very small sites, land development, increased density, and development rates spiked. So there's
Mm.
copious amounts of evidence that if you get the planning reform, if you make it easier to build homes, if you make it easier to get planning permission to build homes, more homes will be built, right? And yes, you're right. Coming back to the question you actually asked me, there is this sort of quick desire for a quick fix and a sort of a quick political hit in some instances, but that tends to be from people who are more opposed from development, because the political benefit of opposing a development, opposing a planning reform, refusing a planning application is immediate. Everybody likes it. The people that think that's a good idea like you straight away. The people that want development to go ahead, I think, are more understanding of the fact that it is long term, that they need to be patient, um, and that might be harder politically. But politics isn't supposed to be easy. You know, politicians
Yeah.
should be taking long term decisions and doing the right thing when it's so obviously the right thing, and when actually there is a lot of public support for it. You know, there's a lot of evidence to say that a majority of people support new home building in their area, in theory, at least, anyway. Um,
Until the application comes in, and they've got a development on the field next door.
yeah, I always say they support it in the abstract, but not in the particular. You know, they think it's a great idea until you tell them where they're going to be built. But the point is that there is some political support for that, and Labour tapped into it at the last election, you know, with their planning reforms. So there's no reason it needn't be a barrier to doing the things that that we need to do to make the system work better.
And out of interest, when they brought in these planning reforms in New Zealand, to be slightly more liberal, but I can't imagine probably just not approving anything that came across their desks. But did they find that um, the developments that were built, whilst they were denser, were still attractive developments, still looked nice, still generated nice places to live? Because you think about unblocking planning in the UK. Uh, and some people might go, well, that's all very well and good, but it just means that house builders will build the most basic, densest housing developments that will actually be, quite ugly places and not very nice places to live. But did you find from your research into New Zealand that was the case, or did actually the developers still build wonderful developments, but they were just able to build them a bit more denser, but still generate that sense of place and community?
Yeah, there was no real impact on quality, and the two key reforms were increasing density near transit stops, and that's the one we've lifted in the UK into the draft NPPF, like I said. And actually, Stuart Donovan was very much of the opinion. He was quite dismissive of that, and basically said it made essentially no difference to housing delivery. The bit that made the impact was what he called the widespread but modest zoning reform in the suburbs, which basically they have a zonal planning system in New Zealand, and in essence, all they did was say land that had previously been zoned for single dwellings, you could now build 3 dwellings on it. And you can do that in different ways. It might be row houses, it might be a small sort of block of apartments. So it was only sort of a very slight increase in density on those individual developments, but it was the accumulation of that happening over many, many sites which made the difference. And because it's SMEs that were building those schemes, who tend to build a more attractive product because everything they build is bespoke, um, in essence. And that was what had the biggest change. And funnily, we saw the same pattern in Croydon with their SPD that I mentioned, which was about slight increases in density, and they got lots of very small development sites coming forward. Your point about design quality, though, is a really interesting one because I'd say two things. Firstly, I think house builders of all types get a bad rep for the quality of the schemes that they deliver. When you walk around a new build housing development that has just been finished, it looks very different than if you walk around that same scheme 10 years later when all the landscaping's matured, right? And all the
Mm.
sharp edges on the bricks have softened and all the rest of it. Funnily enough, earlier this week, I was out looking at a site And I drove past a development that was a site that I'd bought when I was at Taylor Wimpey 15-ish years ago. And I thought, I'll go and have a look and see what it's like. And it looked really nice. All
Mm.
the landscaping had matured. People had done the gardens in different ways. And it felt like a proper nice suburb to live in. And you think, okay, yeah, I can see that. So, and some of this is backed up again by research that this is one of my favourite facts, but um, architects are a really bad predictor of what the public will find attractive in design terms. And the longer you have been an architect for, the more that your view diverges from that of the general public.
Oh, really? That's
Right?
interesting.
There's really good research. There's really good research to back that up. So we do have to sometimes be a little bit careful about what we mean by design quality and who says it is design. Who says what is good design. There's quite a lot of research that will say that people who live in a new build housing development think it's very nice, thank you.
Yes, yeah. Well, I can second that. Having worked for house builders myself, I know that, yeah, that a lot of effort does go into design. I know that they quite often get a bad rep, as you say, but yeah, lots of thought does go into the design of these developments.
And they are stuck in the middle between what, in inverted commas, design professionals are telling them is good design and what house buyers are asking them to build. And they are two very, very different things. And house builders are trying to walk that line between the two, right? Because they need to satisfy both to get planning permission. And that's quite important. But the other point I would make is that because the supply of land is so constrained, the point of competition for house builders isn't actually finding people to buy their home anymore. It's buying the land. House builders are optimized as land buying machines, aren't they? They all talk about their strategic land banks and the amount of land they control and are bringing through the system to deliver consent, because that's the key point of competition for them. You don't get pages and pages in the annual report about all the wonderful sort of new sales processes they're introducing or anything like that, because actually that bit, I'm not saying selling a new build home is easy, far from it, but the key point of competition is buying the land in the first place. And if that is the case, that puts different design pressures on you than if the key point of competition is, well, there's loads of land, I'm going to focus on the design quality because I need to make sure that, there are 4 developers in this town and I need to make sure that everybody comes to my site and not theirs.
And what's driving the land constraints? Is it price? Is it availability? What's making land such a not a scarcity, but a key area of focus for developers?
Land isn't scarce. It's land that you are able to build homes on that is scarce. And that fundamentally comes back to the planning system and the number of planning consents that it will deliver. And, I know the government's housing target is 300,000 homes a year. And the new standard method, um, if you add it up for every authority in the country, will total about, I think it's about 360,000 homes a year. There's a fairly healthy buffer on it. But that isn't actually England's housing target. It's what the total housing target in all our local plans is, surely. And that comes to about 240,000 homes a year. Last time I checked, anyway. It's a bit of a job to work that out, but
Yeah.
it's mid 200,000s, which, funnily enough, is where housing delivery typically tops out at in even the strongest market years. And that's because if you think about how those plans operate, when you're preparing a local plan, your starting point is how many homes do we need to build? How many homes have we already given planning permission for, and we can knock that off, or already allocated land for? You knock that off. How many? What's our urban capacity, or how many SLAR sites have we got? However you want to term it. Authorities then look at sort of sites that are outside of the planning system, but which they think are available and suitable for development, and you knock all of that off. And it's only what is left you then allocate new land for.
Mm.
So you take somewhere like in Greater Manchester with Places for Everyone, which It's the sort of the almost Manchester-wide plan. It covers 9 of the 10 Greater Manchester authorities. And it was really controversial because of the amount of greenbelt it proposed for development. But that greenbelt, it's like 20,000 homes out of a total of, over, I think it's about 170,000, the overall requirement in there. It's a drop in the
Yeah,
ocean.
yeah, absolutely.
But so we're very dependent on those urban capacity sites coming forwards, which tend not to. If they were genuinely available for development now, wouldn't they be being developed already? There's a reason that they're
Well,
not.
yes, and this speaks to, and we've only touched briefly on this because we're fast running out of time. But one of the arguments that's always levied against house builders is that they're land banking, that they've got loads of land, but they're holding on to it because they think that house prices are going to go up in the future. Um, and I thought that had been debunked, but it still keeps coming around. I mean, what are your thoughts on that argument?
Two things. One, this has been looked at quite often, right? I've actually written these down, Ben, because I knew you'd ask this. Land banking was looked at by the Barker Review in 2004, the Calcutt Review in 2007. There was an Office of Fair Trading investigation in 2008. Nick Bowles did a data review when he was planning minister in 2013. There was then Lyons Review in 2014, then Letwin Review in 2018, and then the Competition and Markets Authority did their house building market study in 2024, and none of them found any evidence of land banking, right? I
Yeah,
think that's a pretty thorough investigation of the process or of the allegation. And the reason there's no evidence of it is because it just doesn't make financial sense for them. House builders make profit by selling homes. They have to borrow a load of money to go out and buy the land. And if they then just sit on the land and don't build anything, they're paying interest on the money that they've borrowed, right? They are fundamentally, their key metric is return on capital employed, which is, you can sort of imagine as almost like the interest rate on the amount of money you spend in any given year. How much capital have you got out there, and what percentage return do you make on it on an annual basis? And you only do that by building through sites as quickly as you can. The
yeah,
land banking stuff also presupposes that land values are going up, and actually they've flatlined for the last 5 or 6 years because of a whole host of reasons. They've decoupled for house prices because of the accumulation of regulatory burdens and all sorts of things. So, yeah, it's a useful tool for people who oppose developments to try and say it's nothing to do with the planning system. It's all the mean house builders. But honestly, there's just no evidence whatsoever that it actually happens, and because it just doesn't make sense for house
yeah.
builders to do it.
No, good. I agree. I'm glad you feel the same. It just doesn't make sense, but I keep seeing it coming up time and time again. Okay, so we're almost at an end. I think the final question from me really is, um, what would you like to see in thinking specifically about planning? What would you like to see implemented that perhaps hasn't been talked about or mooted as a potential planning reform yet? Is there anything out there that you think, why don't we introduce this and this would uh, help with the housing crisis?
Ben, that's a great question to ask me at the end, isn't it? We can do another hour on this if you want.
Yeah, I know, it was
Um,
a bit mean, isn't it?
yeah, I mean, look, trying to answer it very briefly, there are two broad areas. One is there are systemic process improvements that you can make, which are, policy agnostic, which just make the system we have move better. It's that grit in the system point that you mentioned at the outset, right? That if we want to build more homes, one thing that we can do is make the planning application process be be as well oiled a machine as it can be. It shouldn't be taking 2 years to get an outline permission for 100 homes. And there's loads of things you can do there, looking at the pre-application process and right through to the other end, looking at how Section 106 agreements and planning gain is dealt with and all sorts of stuff in between. So there's a really interesting piece of work that I know lots of people are looking at to see how we can make that operate more smoothly and more effectively. And then secondly, in terms of some policy changes, I think if we want to build the homes we need, we've got to let our settlements grow up and out. And actually, one of the best ways we can do that is at the moment we have this sort of revolutionary process where every 10, 15 years there's a new local plan and there's lots of housing sites allocated, and you get a spike of development that then tapers off towards the end of the plan period. We sort of we need to find a way of getting back to allowing settlements to sort of gradually evolve like they have done throughout history. And I think there are two ways you can do that. For upwards, and thinking about what happened in New Zealand and that widespread but modest reform, a policy presumption that said you could build a new home, a new building that is no more than 1 story higher than neighbouring properties, and a presumption in favour of that, so that over time you'll get areas gradually densifying. It means as a developer you can go and buy two, 4-bed detached houses in big gardens next to each other, knowing that you can replace that with a 3-story block of apartments, and that's going to get policy support. And then outwards, I think I would look for some sort of permeable or flexible settlement boundaries. So at the moment, the boundary around the edge of the settlement is a very hard divide between where you can build and where you can't build, apart from in a tilted balance type situation. But I think continually we should be looking at how we can sensibly grow beyond those, and some policy that said, sites that are adjacent to settlements, well related to them, proportionate to their scale and the scale and function of the settlement, I think should be okay. I think we should be able to do that, and maybe you need to put some sort of cap on that says, that settlements that only applies provided the settlement hasn't grown by more than an average of 1% per annum, over the previous period or whatever. So if you've got a village of 100 homes, every 10 years you might get a new development of 10 homes somewhere around the edge of it. I don't think that's a big ask or something that will dramatically change the feel of the settlement, but I think it starts to allow those two policies together, start to allow gradual, slower change to increase the baseline rate of development that will be happening regardless of where things are with the local plan process, so that we get more homes coming forwards all the time.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, hopefully someone is listening who can take those ideas and start to put them into practice. We're out of time, unfortunately, but we will have to ask you back on so we can explore those ideas a bit more and on all the other ideas that I'm sure you've got. Thank you, Paul, for coming on. It's been really fascinating to talk to you. If anybody wanted to get in touch with you, how's the best way, or what's the best way to do that?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn, Paul Smith at the Strategic Land Group, and I'm on social media as at Paul_SLG, because when your name is Paul Smith, you can't get a unique, well, it's hard to get a unique social media username.
Yeah, you have to get in right at the start if your name is Paul Smith and
Yeah,
snap that up as soon as you can.
no chance.
Excellent. And if anyone listening is interested to find out a bit more about Brookbanks, please visit brookbanks.com. You can get in touch with us through there and see how we can help support you and your current projects. But it remains for me to say thank you once again, Paul Smith, Managing Director at the Strategic Land Group. It's been great to have you on, and we'll see you next time for another Brookbanks podcast.